Thank you. And before I call the next item of business, I'd like to inform Parliament that we have agreed with business managers that the PO will call the vote on the variation of standing orders, motion 7799 from last Thursday's business at decision time today. And we now move to the next item of business, which is topical questions. Question 1, Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. While I feel I need further time for reflection on the time for reflection today, I will proceed to my question. To ask the Scottish Government, in light of the publication of the report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, what action it is taking to ensure that all relevant policies and proposals are properly costed and acted on to ensure that annual emissions targets are met.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report sends a stronger warning than ever that human activity is changing the global climate and that reducing global greenhouse gas emissions is the only way to limit the extent of future climate change. IPCC's report shows that without global action, we could see surface temperature increases of up to 4.5 degrees Celsius and sea level rises of up to 0.82 metres by the end of the century. The case for global action is compelling, which is why Scotland has set world-leading greenhouse gas emission reduction targets and has detailed plans on how to meet our targets to reduce Scotland's emissions by 42% by 2020. The chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has described the initiatives taken by the Scottish Government for tackling the threats posed by climate change as, and I quote, a matter of pride. However, Scotland's actions alone are not enough, given the IPCC's warning, and we need the rest of the UK, our European neighbours and indeed all countries to share our ambition. And we want to see an ambitious global deal on climate change agreed in 2015 and have been calling for the EU to raise its pre-2020 emissions target.
Claudia Beamish.
I thank the Minister for his response, and I'm very pleased to hear about the recognition for Scotland in the report. However, the NPF indicator on reducing carbon emissions is worsening. And does the Minister acknowledge the huge gap between what is needed to meet our climate change and fuel poverty targets and the current funding for energy efficiency within the Scottish budget?
Minister.
I certainly recognise the seriousness with which Claudia Beamish takes these issues, and just to highlight, the NPF indicator has indeed worsened, but that's in relation to our carbon footprint globally. Our domestic emissions produced within Scotland are on decline, but just to put that difference. But I certainly recognise the need to control our global carbon footprint as well. In terms of the initiatives that we are taking, as the Cabinet Secretary for Finance has set out in the draft budget, and indeed just put on record that today documents which will hopefully help the committees assess the impact of the budget in terms of low carbon activity have been lodged with both SPICE and put on the Government's website. And that does set out that the Government has proposals in the draft budget to spend just under £1.3 billion over the spending review period in tackling climate change.
Claudia Beamish.
I thank the Minister for that detailed answer. Although I do understand in relation to consumption emissions, that the housing situation has been worsening. Can the Minister give further reassurance to the Parliament that the budget fully funds its climate action plan and the RPP2 this year? Although I hear what he's saying, if he cannot, will he come forward with additional funding even at this stage for energy efficiency and travel issues to give confidence that we can meet our future climate change targets?
Minister.
Well, clearly, we recognise the need to follow up the ambition that we've demonstrated in our climate change legislation with action, and I appreciate the sentiment that Claudia Beamish has expressed. We are determined to deliver our proposals that we have set out in our document, the RPP2, and just in relation to homes and communities, which does include Sustainable Action Fund and Climate Challenge Fund as well. We're spending £380.7 million over the three-year period up to 2015-16. I appreciate that many, including Ms Beamish and others, are calling for more action. What we have to do is deliver a climate change strategy which can be delivered by the economy, and in terms of the availability of skills as well as the availability of finance, that has some challenges. But I can assure her that we're doing everything we can to deliver on our commitments.
Many thanks. Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. The IPCC's new report proposes a global carbon budget approach, highlighting that the world, if we're to have a reasonable chance of avoiding 2 degrees of warming, can only afford in future to burn somewhere between 500 and 800 gigatons to emit 500 and 800 gigatons of CO2, yet the global fossil fuel reserves would emit 3,000 gigatons if they are used, and the fossil fuel industry is spending hundreds of billions of dollars looking for more. Does the Minister accept this general conclusion that we must leave most of our fossil fuels unburned? And what are the implications for the economy of a country like Scotland that's still dependent on extracting and burning them?
Minister.
Well, I certainly accept the point that's in IPCC's analysis that there is obviously a substantial reserve of fossil fuels which, if they were burned, would damage the global effort to tackle climate change. So I certainly recognise that point that Mr Harvey has made and agree with it. Where we have, I suppose, is an opportunity in Scotland, because we do have, obviously, as the member has indicated, fossil fuels ourselves, which we are exploiting for economic gain for Scotland, but it also allows us the opportunity to make the transition to a low-carbon economy. We do clearly set out a number of strategies, including the recently announced sort of route map in terms of delivering low-carbon transport, to try and migrate to a situation where we're not dependent on fossil fuel use for our personal transport by 2050. And that's just one example of setting a goal and trying to get to that goal. Inevitably, we will depend to some degree on fossil fuels in the interim, but I assure the member that it's my intention to do whatever I can to support the decarbonisation of Scotland's economy.
Patrick Harvey.
I wasn't aware I'd get a second bite at the cherry, but I'd be happy to ask the Minister to come further than that and explain what proportion of Scotland's fossil fuels he believes need to remain in the ground unburned.
Minister.
Sorry, microphones. Thank you. I don't have a figure to give Mr Harvey in terms of the percentage that I would like to see retained in, under the earth, but I do accept the point that if we were to burn all the fossil fuels in the world, we would be doing untold damage to our environment. What we do have is an opportunity, to say, to steward our resources. We need to look after that finite resource carefully, not burn it at a rate which is unsustainable, and to ensure that we manage the transition as quickly as we possibly can to a low-carbon economy. So I do appreciate the stance that Mr Harvey is coming from, and it's a principal stance which I very much respect. But we are trying to do what we can to make the transition to a low-carbon economy as quickly as we can, and hopefully that in itself will reduce our dependency on fossil fuels and ensure that we have viable alternatives to use of conventional fuels in our personal transport.
Many thanks. Graham Day.
Thank you. Can I ask, is the Minister aware of the deeply irresponsible comments made by UK Environment Secretary Owen Paterson at a Conservative Conference Fringe event, where he spoke of positive aspects to global warming and appeared to suggest that rather than act now, we could adapt to its consequences as we went along? Does the Minister agree with me that these remarks betray a complete lack of understanding of the damaging impact climate change has had and will have both at home when it comes to our farming, our coastal communities and those towns and villages already being impacted by severe flooding events, as well, of course, as elsewhere in the world?
Minister.
Well, the member is absolutely right. Climate change has the potential to devastate lives across the globe, and particularly in developing nations who, of course, have not caused the problem in the first place. Although the impacts of climate change in Scotland might be less severe, perhaps, than in many other parts of the world, and could present some opportunities, and I stress some opportunities, very limited ones, it will have potentially very significant negative impacts on our individuals, communities and our economy, and reducing global emissions must be taken seriously, but we must prepare effectively for the unavoidable climate change we face. And Mr Patterson's comments, I think, are unhelpful. It's worth bearing in mind that Mr Patterson may well be representing the UK at the COP in Warsaw this year. And I think any message that undermines that message that we've had consistently from UK ministers and Scottish ministers about the importance of climate change is pretty dangerous at this stage.
Mr Day, briefly.
Thank you. Mr Patterson was, of course, taken to task by Guy Newey, Head of Environment and Energy at the Policy Exchange think tank, who said that the point that the climate has been changing for centuries understates the size of the problem we are facing and the size of the action we need to overcome it. We really have no idea of what's going to happen in terms of temperature. The risk is really very scary. Does the Minister agree with me that Mr Newey has a far better handle on matters than Mr Patterson? Minister.
Absolutely. I fundamentally agree with Mr Day's point. I mean, it's true to say, the IPCC report summarised the evidence from over 800 expert climate scientists about the impact that we are having on our environment and the dangers posed to our society as we know it. I think it is certainly an ill-judged comment at this stage for Mr Patterson to come out with a comment that undermines that approach, and at a time when we all should be pulling together. And notice Mr Davey, the Energy and Climate Change Minister for the UK Government, was much clearer in his understanding of the report, and perhaps he should represent the UK at that conference.
Thank you. Jamie McGregor.
Thank you. Does the Minister agree that reducing the amount of energy that's wasted in Scottish homes through poor insulation is a key aim, and what additional efforts are planned by the Scottish Government to tackle this? Minister.
Well, clearly, mitigation of climate change is one aspect of our strategy. We have to control the use of energy and improve energy efficiency. So the member is absolutely right to highlight the importance of that investment. That's why it is hopefully to be welcomed by all members across the chamber, the investment that is being made, both through the Green Deal UK-wide, but also domestic effort through Warm Homes Fund, to make sure that we do have sufficient resource going into addressing the energy efficiency of our homes. We do have a concern, obviously, about harder to treat properties where we have solid walls and other difficult issues to tackle, which are more expensive, as I'm sure the member knows. But we're doing everything we can within our resources at this time, as I said to Ms Beamish earlier on, to try and address the challenge.
Thanks. Stuart Stevenson.
Does the Minister recall that one of the key contributions to the considerations of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was the seminal report from Sir Nicholas Stern? That report, of course, identified that the costs of not dealing with climate change were some 10 times as great as those of dealing with climate change. Does he therefore still agree that all governments should take notice of that, as this is both an environmental and an economic disaster that could engulf the world?
Thanks. Minister.
I absolutely agree 100% with what Stuart Stevenson has said. As Nicholas Stern has identified the fact that countries that act quickly and act sooner will prevent much greater cost to their economy in the longer term. That's why when we are engaging on international issues regarding climate change, we're stressing to other countries not just what Scotland's doing because we want to talk about a positive story in Scotland, but trying to say to them that there are advantages in moving quickly to address climate mitigation, which will save their economies costs in the long run. They will be able to exploit the economic opportunities that arise from creating either a low-carbon economy or circular economy in terms of handling waste. And that will help them to generate jobs and investment and prosperity in the countries, as well as tackling the fundamental problem that the member quite rightly identifies, that we face huge costs as a society if we were not to act now. The IPCC's report indicates, as I say, temperature ranges up to 4.5 degrees Celsius, and I hope I don't have to tell members the devastation it would cause, not just in Scotland but around the globe, to our key markets if we had temperature rises of that scale, and sea level rises of 0.82 metres, which may have a devastating impact even in Scotland and some of our smaller islands like in the US and in the Shetland Islands, where many areas are low-lying and much of our heritage is vulnerable to rising sea levels. So we all have an interest in dealing with this, both from the point of view of protecting our society from devastating change, but also in terms of exploiting the economic opportunities that arise from it.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the Minister particularly about the housing issue, which a couple of colleagues have mentioned, and does he see the particular challenge in the private rented sector where the houses are already built but it's difficult getting investment in, and the potential Sullivan recommendations? Are there particular issues he sees there as opportunities to really ramp up the energy efficiency and social justice issues at the same time?
Minister.
Certainly, Sarah Boyack raises an important point, because much of the effort in terms of tackling emissions standards and energy efficiency in housing is relating to new build properties. And clearly we have a huge challenge in a country like Scotland, where we have much fantastic heritage and built heritage, but it is of a design which is inherently inefficient from a point of view of climate change. So we do have a difficulty and a challenge to address, and I say the cost per unit obviously rises dramatically when you're dealing with solid wall insulation and other measures which are required to tackle these kind of properties, and so hence resources are required. But we also have a manpower issue in terms of the availability of skills. It's a matter that surprised me as a minister, despite the downturn in the construction sector, that we do not have a surfeit of skills that we can turn to tackle this issue. And we do need to draw upon the expertise of some of our skilled trades to convert their skill base to be able to implement energy efficiency measures in our housing. So in the medium to long term, I'm confident we can probably step up and increase our response to this. But in the short term, we do have some severe challenges.
Many thanks. And that concludes topical questions. And we now move to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 7867, in the name of Kenny McCaskill on the rehabilitation of offenders.